My name's Ryan, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the background on Rana boylii, since we haven't covered too much in depth about boylii to this point. So let's see if we can make this go. Okay, so boylii is one of the only stream-dwelling frogs in California, and it's, as you can see in that picture, it really likes cobble, kind of low gradient habitat, and hanging out on cobbles. The adults particularly like to hang out in cobbles and boulders, basking. The range is throughout a good portion of California and into Oregon. They are occurring, if take a look on the inner kind of, on the Sierra Nevada range there, there's a lot of hydroelectric projects that occur in that same area. And so one of the issues is that as part of relicensing or the renewal of these hydroelectric projects, the hydroelectric companies conduct various studies, including amphibian studies. And considering that some of the larger inland populations of boylii co-occur with the hydro projects, this is definitely an issue. And we don't, the good news is that amphibians, particularly Rana boylii, are being included in these studies. And it's a species of concern listed in California in 1994. And so the good news is they are being included as part of these studies because people have decided that they're important enough to do studies on, which is good in one sense. The bad news is we really don't know much about how these populations are affected by the hydroelectric projects. We don't know much about their movement or kind of breeding. It's really an unknown. So understanding their life history is really essential to figuring out the dynamics of how they're going to do in these situations. So just a basic overview of life history of Rana boylii. They lay eggs that take they prefer cobble bars and slow-moving areas. It takes about 2 weeks for the eggs to hatch, turn into tadpoles, and then they generally metamorphose in the same summer they lay the eggs, or the same season they lay the eggs. And then juveniles become sexually mature within 1 to 2 years. And the adults generally hang out in tributaries and streams upstream of where they're breeding. So the areas that are most generally likely to be impacted by flows downstream of dams are the egg masses and the tadpoles, particularly with earlier, Hart Welsh had a really great slide showing scour and desiccation in the Trinity, and those are definitely concerns that are kind of focused on in these hydro projects. So the objective for this presentation is really to provide an overview of the types of studies that are done on amphibians, and to give you an idea of what we're finding and initiate kind of an idea about what are some gaps and some possible improvements we might be able to make. There we go. Okay, so I know some of you may be more familiar with hydro-relicensing than others, and so I'm going to try to keep this as quick as possible because it can get a bit dry at times. So as mentioned before, many of the studies are conducted as part of hydro-relicensing, including fish and geomorphology and macroinvertebrates, and it's just it's an all-inclusive, as inclusive as possible look at the watershed and how dams are affecting the watershed and how the regulated flows are affecting the watershed. So amphibian studies being one part of that, and I should mention, so the hydro-relicensing is mandated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and these dams have a 30-year license generally. So these licenses are coming up in the next next 10 years. There's over 25 projects in the Pacific Northwest alone that are going to be relicensed. So this is definitely a current topic, and that's not even including all the projects that are already operating and or who have just been renewed. So this is the licenses are kind of becoming they're all phasing into the point where they need to be relicensed by FERC. So to talk about how amphibian studies play into this, They are generally broken into two parts, two phases. And phase one, it generally occurs over the time frame of 1 year, essentially. And so it's broken into parts of reviewing historical data if there's any available. There's very little available, just so you all know. Most of these projects, there's not much known at all about boylii populations. Identifying and evaluating potentially suitable habitat is really necessary to, you have a reach of 70 or more miles of river, and you do not have the time or the financial ability to survey all 70 miles of that river. So you need to narrow it down to kind of a sample of that, subsample. And then conducting presence and absence surveys, which include all the life stages I mentioned, eggs, tadpoles, juveniles, and adults, and really tend to focus on the egg and tadpole stages initially, which I'll talk about later. And then phase two develops a more focused study to address the potential effects of the dams. So once you've identified that there is boylii or another amphibian species in the reach, then the goal after that year of surveys and identifying basic distribution, basically to figure out what are some questions that will help us identify possible mechanisms of impact from the dams or the regulated flows. So I'd like to talk a little bit about just kind of an overview of some studies that we did and give you some interesting results that we found, particularly that we've found are to be very unique compared to a lot of the current literature on boylii. Even in some of the hydro areas, it's not really in the literature about what these frogs are doing or what the habitat they're using, et cetera. So I'd just like to mention we're going to talk about the South Fork of the American River and the South Fork of the Feather River. And the two main kind of topics are oviposition location and the evidence of movement and habitat use. And these reaches are definitely fairly large hydro areas and fairly large streams in California. They both flow into or eventually are tributaries to the Sacramento River. And just to talk a little bit about these, just a basic, and this is just kind of a basic overview of the difference between an unimpaired flow and a regulated flow. As you can see, the kind of seasonal pattern in the unimpaired is pretty evident, where you have winter flow and winter storms that causing peaks in the hydrograph, and then the spring occurs and snow melt occurs, and then you have a descending limb tapering out over the summer. Whereas in a regulated hydrograph, you have much more of a stair-step kind of picture, and those spikes, although that's not a great example, the example that Hart Welsh had of the Trinity was much better, can show basically those spikes occur in generally a very short period of time and can either desiccate or scour or strand eggs, as well as flush tadpoles, or there's many other issues that can occur. And something to mention, both of these projects were in fairly steep canyon areas, not very accessible, generally bedrock-dominated reaches with tended to not have a whole lot of cobble, but they did have a fair amount of suitable habitat for these frogs. So to talk about, let's talk about the South Fork of the American, which is nearest Sacramento, and we looked at a lot of river, and we found frogs in only a 3-mile stretch. The adit there at the top, which I'll talk about in a minute, is the most upstream area, and flow goes downstream to the confluence, Silver Creek there, to the confluence of the South Fork of the American, and then to El Dorado Powerhouse. So some interesting, unique oviposition habitat I'd like to mention. This is El Dorado Powerhouse. And just so you know, that's the powerhouse in the background. Flow is moving in this kind of, the flow moves out this way and then comes down towards the people in the audience. And we found egg masses in this kind of secluded area, maybe 20 meters downstream of the powerhouse. It was maybe 30 square meters of habitat total. And this is where we found an egg mass just upstream of this, one egg mass and one tadpole later in the summer. And it should be mentioned that this powerhouse was offline during our surveys. And we, like I said earlier, the amphibian study part usually takes, you have about 2 years to do the phase 1 and phase 2, 2 to 3 years. So given that it was offline and the picture, and particularly after Whit Gibbons' talk, it's really hard to assess, you know, is this something they continually used, or it was just available, or even the possibility that they're being flushed down. It was, you know, a fragment of a population upstream, and they just happened to make it down to the powerhouse, found some habitat, and used it as oviposition habitat that year. We're not really sure. Some more interesting habitat use. This is Silver Creek, which is further upstream, about 2 to 3 miles upstream. And here, another interesting thing, so aside from using powerhouse kind of habitat, they, like I said earlier, there's very little cobble, and they were using basically using underneath large boulders and bedrock to the point where you really, in order to find the egg masses, you had to basically snorkel under to see an egg mass because there's really no way to visually see it when you're just walking, which obviously makes surveys much more intensive, and your likelihood of identifying egg masses is often limited sometimes, but you don't really know that until you actually find one under these really steep areas. And then I'd like to mention, so one of the more interesting and kind of surprising habitat use and movement issues that we identified, this is the adit slope, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we basically found frogs up, so the top of that slope that you saw, and I'm not going to try to go back, but the top of that slope is about 1,000 feet from the main stem Silver Creek, and it's over about a 45-degree gradient, and it's just rocks. There's no stream corridor, seep, or anything like that. And an adit essentially is what this is. What they use to excavate rock out when they're building the penstock for the powerhouses. And so we found frogs in this tunnel area hanging out, juveniles and adults, and all the way probably 60 feet back into this tunnel. And there was just recently a rock slide there just this last year. And so we don't know how these frogs are getting up there, if they're moving, you know, in one day, given a lot of recent research showing that these frogs move, particularly a lot of ranids move a lot more than maybe was previously thought. You know, it is possible they're moving up over those rocky slopes over dry land, but it's still very interesting. And the water is permanently here during all year long. We didn't identify any breeding, but we did find we found tree frog tadpoles, Pacific tree frog tadpoles in this area. But there's water probably no more than 10 to 15 centimeters deep, and it's fairly cold most of the year. So it's really something we don't know much about, and given the time constraints we had, we didn't really have time to kind of follow up with more detailed study. And then just down the road, an access road that goes to that adit, probably about 3/4 of a mile down the road, we found juveniles in this seep. And keep in mind, the road is along the canyon wall, so it's fairly sheer on one side, and then you have a very steep kind of, this cliff goes up for quite a ways, and it's a seep, and we found just in this ditch along the road, juveniles. So if they're coming down the road from the seep, or from the adit, or coming up from the main stem of the Silver Creek, we don't know. So let's move on to some other interesting kind of similar habitat usages that we identified. South Feather River was another one of our hydroelectric projects that we worked on, and it's north of Sacramento, about 90 miles or so. We found 2 populations. It's a fairly large project. There's a lot of water and a lot of suitable habitat, but we identified 2 populations in the lower South Feather, right above Lake Oroville, and then in Slate Creek, which is a tributary to the North Yuba. So this is the same picture, or the same site, pardon me, and we found an egg mass right about here, and we were there. We monitored one basically every week, and we came back the following week, and the water depth had increased by about 2 feet. So this is definitely something along reservoir. This is kind of the top of a reservoir margin, and probably what was historically a cobble bar, and they're breeding there. So how they're, like, if they're using this every year or not, we don't really know. We identified it 2 years in a row, but as we've seen from other data presented here, that doesn't necessarily mean they're using it all the time. And then this is another site just upstream of Lake Oroville, and actually it's Ponderosa Reservoir, but where flows, same thing. We have an egg mass right here and right here, or same site, and flows, or the reservoir level increased. Actually, here it was like 2.5 to 3 feet. And keep in mind, we identified the egg masses probably right after they'd been deposited, and then we came back a week later and the flows had increased. Now, we did see tadpoles, so some tadpoles hatched out successfully from these egg masses, but we don't know how survival was affected. Another interesting movement area is the Feeney Ravine, which there basically is a culvert. Feeney Ravine is a tributary to Slate Creek, and there's a dam about 200 meters upstream of here. Frogs were found upstream and downstream of this culvert, and as you can see, it's quite a drop. It's not likely that they're going to be using the culvert to move across the road, and we don't really know how that's affecting movement in the area. Are they using the road? Is there any road mortality? We didn't observe any, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not occurring. And given the time constraints of 2 years, or even less than that, it's really hard to figure that out. So culverts seem to be a kind of common theme. This is Woodlin Powerhouse. That picture I showed you earlier of the reservoir fluctuation, there was an egg mass site there, and there was breeding upstream of here as well. Powerhouse and the penstock are there, and we identified a ditch basically right along the powerhouse. You can see the road here, and here's the ditch. And we found juveniles all up and down here, particularly in the spring and early summer. It dries up towards the end of the summer, but there is a seep that has permanent water for most of the year. And we found frogs under the culvert. The culvert runs under the road and into the reservoir, and we found frogs in the culvert and in the ditch when it had water. Always juveniles. We never found adults. We never found tadpoles. We don't know if they're moving downstream past the powerhouse. I mean, the flows are cranking through here where the penstock release, generating power. Or we just don't know. The movement, this site is really interesting, really intriguing, and keep in mind the great cliffs on both sides. So moving overland would be fairly difficult, but you never know. So to kind of summarize really quickly, these projects have been in place for about 30 years. So have these frogs adapted to living in these areas of regulated flows under dams? We don't know. It's definitely unique habitat. There's potentially significant movement over land, use of man-made tunnels and culverts. And really, I didn't discuss much of the phase 2 studies, the more focused studies we did, but really we kind of found there's no efficient way to determine the effects of flow or connectivity in the time frame that you have. So to kind of wrap things up a bit, generally efforts on on boylii are focused on eggs and larval stages because they're static and they're most generally easiest to find and they're not moving around a bunch. And if you're just coming into an area you've never been to and there's no historical data, it's really the best way to go about it. However, that doesn't help you really get a good handle on the size of the population because eggs and tadpole numbers obviously are not a good statistic of that, and also it doesn't really give you an idea of movement and where the adult and juvenile habitat might be. So possibly including as much as possible of the movement time frame in the fall and early spring as part of the surveys would be a really good thing to try as much as possible within the constraints to do. I got to go a little bit faster. So the phase 2, one of the most important things I think is integration of ongoing research and aid from academic experts, really involving a lot of the current research we're seeing here and elsewhere is really important to maybe try to make these. There's a lot of these projects going on and we need to increase as much as we can of our knowledge, and so each study should possibly build on the next one as part of maybe a meta-analysis or something along those lines, but we really need to bridge the gap between kind of academia and consulting and agencies and everything else. And like I said earlier, given the short time frame, it's a source or a sink. We don't know. Over time, we have a limited amount of time. And balance between, it's all, hydro-relicensing is a balance between many species, fish, frogs, and vertebrates, and these decisions aren't mutually exclusive. So we need to decide and make a good judgment based on what we have, which obviously having a long-term study would be great, but we don't. So these are basically conclusions. Need to better understand dispersible and movement in hydro systems. We need a more integrated approach for the second phase studies, possibly longer studies. Conserve hydraulically stable habitat. Sarah Kupferberg and Amy Lind and a number of other folks have really shown this is really, really important, particularly in regulated reaches. And we need to share more information amongst all the different groups. Thank you.